Austere, where the real story begins after the camera stopped rolling, the truth and TLC.
Something quietly shifted on Sister Wives. And if you've been watching closely, you felt it too. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic music swelling in the background. It wasn't a screaming match or a door slamming shut. It was subtler than that. A look that lingered a little too long. A pause before answering a question. A sentence that felt rehearsed instead of raw. Something changed, and it doesn't feel accidental. For years, Sister Wives thrived on the idea of controlled chaos. The Brown family presented plural marriage as complicated but functional, emotional but manageable, messy but rooted in faith and commitment. Even when cracks started forming, there was still a sense that the foundation existed somewhere beneath the surface. But now, the foundation feels gone, and what makes this shift so powerful isn't just who left. It's how the entire tone of the show transformed afterward. When Christine walked away, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. When Janelle followed, it felt like momentum. When Meri finally confirmed what everyone already suspected, it felt like closure. But somewhere between those exits and the current conversations unfolding on screen, the energy changed. The show stopped trying to convince us. In earlier seasons, the narrative often circled back to hope. Even during conflict, there was always a confessional moment where someone would say, "We're still a family." That reassurance became part of the rhythm. No matter how tense things got, the idea of unity hovered nearby. Now, that reassurance is missing. Instead, we're seeing something much more unfiltered. Conversations don't end in comfort. They end in silence, or in someone walking away, or in a shrug that says more than words ever could. And then there's Kody. There was a time when his confidence carried the storyline. Whether viewers agreed with him or not, he projected authority, leadership, conviction. But lately, his presence feels different. Not softer, not calmer. Just exposed. There's a defensiveness that wasn't always this visible. A sharpness in his tone. A need to reframe history in real time. And every time he does it, you can almost feel the audience collectively lean in. Because when someone starts rewriting the past, it usually means the present isn't working. Robyn's role feels heavier too. In past seasons, she often positioned herself as the emotional bridge, the one trying to hold everyone together. But now, that narrative feels strained. The tears don't land the same way. The explanations feel layered. And when she says, she never wanted this outcome, it clashes with how events actually unfolded. It's not about villainizing anyone. It's about noticing the gap between what's being said and what's being shown, and that gap is where the shift lives. Another subtle change? The kids. They're no longer background characters reacting quietly. They're speaking openly. Setting boundaries. Sharing how the family structure impacted them in ways that don't align with the original vision presented to viewers. When adult children start voicing perspectives that challenge the narrative, it changes everything. Suddenly, this isn't just about marital dynamics. It's about generational consequences, and the cameras don't shy away from it. That's what makes this feel intentional. Reality television often smooths over fractures to preserve long-term storytelling. But here, it feels like the editing is leaning into discomfort instead of avoiding it. Awkward pauses are left in. Hard statements aren't softened with uplifting music. The show feels less like a defense and more like documentation. It almost feels like an audit of everything that came before. There's also a noticeable absence of group scenes. Remember when the family gathered for holidays, even if tensions simmered underneath? Now, those large-scale gatherings feel like artifacts from another era. The separation is no longer theoretical. It's physical, emotional, final. And yet, the die show continues. That alone says something. Instead of wrapping up with a neat bow when the plural marriage structure unraveled, sister wives kept rolling. Which suggests this phase isn't an accident. It's a deliberate exploration of what happens after the dream collapses. We're watching the aftermath. Christine's independent storyline carries a completely different energy. There's lightness there, laughter that doesn't feel forced, a sense of rediscovery. And whether viewers agree with her choices or not, it's undeniable that her segments feel emotionally freer. Janelle's path feels steadier, more analytical. She doesn't seem rushed. She seems resolved. Her conversations are less about anger and more about clarity. Meri's arc might be the most layered of all. For years, she hovered in emotional limbo. Now that she's stepping out of it, there's a quiet strength emerging. Not explosive, not dramatic, just firm. And when you place those three trajectories side by side, a pattern emerges. Growth. Not perfect growth, not pain-free growth, but growth that contrasts sharply with the energy surrounding Kody and Robyn, which brings us back to that shift. It's no longer about saving plural marriage. It's about examining why it failed, at least in this version. The show doesn't frame it as a philosophical debate anymore. It frames it as lived reality, and that's heavier. There's also something telling about the way flashbacks are used now. Instead of nostalgic montages celebrating unity, older clips feel almost ironic. Smiles from earlier seasons now carry an undercurrent of tension viewers didn't recognize at the time. It's like watching a prequel after knowing the ending. Every promise echoes differently. Every vow sounds more fragile. Even Kody's earlier declarations about fairness and equality hit differently when contrasted with current admissions from his former wives about favoritism and emotional distance. And when those admissions aren't aggressively challenged in editing, when they're allowed to stand, it feels significant. Because reality shows can shape perception, they can protect certain narratives. They can spotlight specific heroes and minimize specific criticisms. But right now, Sister Wives feels less curated, less protective, more transparent, and transparency changes everything. You can feel it in the pacing, in the music choices, in the way interviews linger after uncomfortable statements. It's almost as if the show is inviting viewers to draw their own conclusions instead of steering them toward one. That's not accidental. It feels like a conscious pivot. Maybe it's because the illusion can't be maintained anymore. Maybe it's because the audience has grown more discerning. Or maybe it's because the cast themselves no longer feel obligated to uphold the original mission statement. Whatever. The reason, something shifted. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. As the seasons move forward, another layer of this shift becomes impossible to ignore: accountability. In earlier years, conflict often dissolved into circular conversations. Someone would express hurt, someone else would counter with intention. And eventually, the issue would be framed as a misunderstanding. But now, those loops don't resolve the same way. When someone says they felt neglected, dismissed, or deprioritized, the statement hangs there. It isn't quickly reframed into, "We were all doing our best." It lingers, and lingering truth feels different. One of the most revealing changes is how time is discussed. There's a noticeable emphasis on who got it, who didn't, and who felt the imbalance most. In plural marriage, time is currency. It represents love, priority, effort. When that currency becomes unevenly distributed, resentment compounds quietly, over years. What we're seeing now isn't sudden dissatisfaction. It's the unveiling of long-standing fractures. The wives aren't just describing recent events. They're revisiting patterns. Moments that once seemed small are being re-examined. With hindsight, and hindsight is powerful. It reframes everything. When Christine reflects on years of feeling like she had to beg for emotional intimacy, it doesn't come across as dramatic. It feels methodical, thought through, processed. That's part of the shift. These aren't explosive reactions. They're conclusions. Janelle's tone is especially telling. She's not fiery, she's measured. When she speaks about independence, finances, or feeling unsupported, it sounds less like a breakup speech and more like a strategic debrief. That calm clarity carries weight, and Meri, who once clung tightly to the idea of reconciliation, now speaks with a different cadence. There's less pleading, less waiting, more self-definition. Meanwhile, the resistance to that clarity becomes visible too. Kody's frustration often centers around loyalty, respect, perceived betrayal. But what stands out is the disconnect between how he views loyalty and how the others define partnership. When someone's expectation of obedience clashes with someone else's expectation of emotional reciprocity, something has to give, and eventually it did. Another noticeable shift is how language around faith is used. In earlier seasons, religious conviction underpinned almost every major decision. It justified the structure. It validated the sacrifice. But now, that spiritual framework feels quieter. Not absent, just less central to the justification. That silence speaks volumes. When belief stops being the anchor and personal well-being becomes the focus, the entire dynamic shifts. What once felt like endurance for a higher purpose begins to look like endurance at personal cost, and the audience feels that recalibration. There's also something fascinating about how independence is portrayed. When Christine began building a life outside the original family unit, the tone wasn't punitive. It wasn't framed as reckless or selfish. It was shown as evolution. That matters. Reality television has a long history of punishing women who leave complicated dynamics. Editing can cast them as impulsive, dramatic, or ungrateful. But here, the storytelling feels different. Her happiness isn't undermined, it's acknowledged. The same goes for Janelle's focus on financial autonomy. Conversations about property, assets, and long-term security are given serious weight. There's no dramatic soundtrack framing it as greed. It's framed as practicality. That tonal choice reinforces the idea that this shift is intentional. Even Robyn's scenes feel different. Instead of being positioned as the peacemaker, there's a heavier atmosphere, a defensiveness that suggests she feels scrutinized, not just by the other wives, but by the audience. Her explanations often circle back to how she never wanted division. Yet the visual reality tells a more complex story. When perception and intention diverge, tension builds, and the editing no longer shields that tension. Another major shift: vulnerability from unexpected places. The adult children, especially, are no longer filtering their experiences to protect a shared narrative. They speak about feeling distant from their father, about communication breakdowns, about how the structure impacted their sense of belonging. That changes the emotional stakes. It's one thing for spouses to disagree, it's another for children to describe relational loss. When those voices enter the conversation, the show moves beyond marital drama into legacy. What will this family structure mean long-term? What stories will the next generation carry forward? Those questions sit quietly beneath the surface of every episode now. Even the physical spaces reflect the shift. Separate homes feel less temporary and more permanent. Plans that once centered around shared land and unified living feel abandoned. The dream of one big house, once controversial but symbolic, now feels like a relic. The vision dissolved before it was ever built. And perhaps that's the clearest evidence that this wasn't just emotional drift, it was structural collapse. There's also an interesting recalibration of power. In the past, Kody's decisions often felt final. Whether viewers agreed or not, the hierarchy was clear. Now that hierarchy feels fractured. Decisions are being made independently. Lives are moving forward without centralized approval. Authority has diffused, and with that diffusion comes unpredictability. Because the show is no longer about maintaining a plural marriage model. It's about individuals redefining themselves outside of it. That's a very different premise. You can feel it in the pacing of episodes. There's less chaos, but more depth. Fewer loud group confrontations, but more introspective confessionals. It feels almost documentary-like at times, as if the goal shifted from entertainment to examination. And when reality television leans into examination, it can become unexpectedly revealing. The most telling moments aren't the arguments, they're the silences, the long pauses after difficult truths, the facial expressions that flash across someone's face before they regain composure. Those are the moments that don't feel accidental. They feel left in on purpose, which raises an important question. Is the show evolving because the family evolved, or because the audience demanded more transparency? It might be both. Viewers today are more media literate than ever. They recognize editing patterns. They question narratives. They analyze subtext. If something feels staged or overly protective, it gets called out instantly. Maybe Sister Wives. Adapted. Maybe the producers realized that the real story, the unraveling, was more compelling than preserving the illusion of unity. Or maybe the cast themselves stopped cooperating with the old framing. Whatever the reason, the result is undeniable. Something shifted. The energy is heavier but more honest. The conflicts are quieter but more permanent. The optimism that once framed every challenge has been replaced by realism. And realism, while less comforting, feels truer. We're not watching a family try to survive plural marriage anymore. We're watching individuals rebuild after it. There's also a noticeable emotional fatigue that runs through the recent episodes. And it doesn't just belong to one person. It feels collective. In the earlier years, even during intense disagreements, there was energy. A kind of frantic determination to make it work. Arguments were loud, but they were fueled by the belief that resolution was possible. Now the arguments feel slower, heavier, less reactive, and more resigned. Resignation is powerful. When people stop fighting for the same outcome, it changes the entire emotional temperature of a room, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Not explosive chaos, but emotional withdrawal. One of the clearest signs of this shift is how conflict is approached. Instead of trying to persuade each other, conversations often sound like closing statements. Christine doesn't argue to change Kody's mind anymore. She explains her perspective and moves forward. Janelle doesn't plead for understanding. She asserts her boundaries. Even Meri, who once seemed willing to wait indefinitely, now speaks with finality. There's something almost courtroom-like about it. Statements are made, positions are clarified, and then distance. What's particularly interesting is how memory is being renegotiated in real time. When past events are discussed, there's often disagreement about how they happened, but instead of those disputes spiraling into dramatic confrontations, they're allowed to exist as parallel truths. That's a subtle but significant change. It signals that there's no longer a shared narrative everyone is trying to protect. Each person is telling their version, and the show isn't aggressively correcting anyone. That feels intentional. Another shift? Humor is different. It's less about shared inside jokes and more about self-awareness. Christine laughs more, freely now, but it's a laughter that feels detached from the original family structure. Janelle's dry humor often carries an edge of realism. Even Meri's lighter moments seem rooted in independence rather than collective identity. The shared comedic rhythm the family once had is gone, and in its place is something more individual. Then there's the symbolism of space. In earlier seasons, proximity mattered. Who lived near whom? Who traveled together? Who gathered for milestones? Now, physical separation mirrors emotional separation. Scenes are often filmed in different states, different homes, different lives. Geography has become metaphor, and the metaphor is clear. Unity isn't the goal anymore. Kody's narrative continues to revolve around respect and loyalty, but what stands out is how often he frames departure as betrayal rather than incompatibility. That framing feels like a holdover from the earlier seasons, when maintaining structure was the priority. But the others aren't operating from that framework anymore. They're operating from self-preservation. That contrast creates tension without shouting. It's quiet but sharp. Robyn's dynamic within this new landscape is complicated. There's a sense that she feels the weight of public perception more than ever. When she expresses sadness about the family breaking apart, it sounds genuine. But it also sounds defensive, as though she's aware that viewers are evaluating every word. That awareness changes performance, and when performance shifts, authenticity becomes a question. Not necessarily because someone is being dishonest, but because self-consciousness alters tone. Another striking evolution is how accountability is handled. In previous seasons, responsibility for conflict often felt diffused. We all struggled. This was hard for everyone. Now, responsibility feels more individualized. Specific grievances are named, specific actions are cited. There's less collective shielding. And that transparency reshapes viewer perception. The adult children continue to add depth to this transformation. Their willingness to speak candidly about emotional distance, especially with their father, reframes the entire narrative arc of the show. It's no longer just about romantic relationships. It's about parental presence. When grown children describe feeling sidelined or disconnected, it echoes louder than marital complaints ever could. Legacy is harder to ignore than love stories, and that brings us to something even more subtle: grief. Not just grief over relationships ending, but grief over identity. For decades, the Brown C family identity was rooted in plural marriage. It defined holidays, routines, sacrifices, even pride. As that structure dissolves, so does the identity built around it. Who are they now? That question hangs over every episode. Christine seems to be answering it by redefining herself outside of the plural framework. Janelle appears to be redefining stability on her own terms. Meri is rediscovering autonomy. But Kody's identity was perhaps most intertwined with the role of patriarch. When that role fractures, the loss isn't just relational, it's existential, and existential shifts are rarely smooth. Another telling element is the absence of long-term future planning as a group. Remember the ambitious discussions about shared land, unified housing, and generational legacy? Those conversations once fueled entire seasons. Now, the future is discussed individually. There is no shared blueprint anymore. That absence feels deliberate, because the show could have attempted to pivot back toward reconciliation. It could have built suspense around possible reunions or renewed commitments, but instead it leans into finality, and finality doesn't generate the same hopeful anticipation. It generates reflection. That's the biggest tonal shift of all. Sister Wives once sold a vision, imperfect but purposeful. Now it examines the cost of that vision. It feels less like a defense of plural marriage and more like a case study. Even the pacing supports that idea. Scenes breathe longer. Interviews are more contemplative. There's space for uncomfortable truths to settle before moving on. It's almost as if the show trusts the audience to sit with complexity. And complexity is rarely accidental. Something behind the scenes allowed this pivot. Whether it was producer influence, cast insistence, or simply the inevitability of reality catching up with narrative, the shift is real. We're watching the deconstruction of a long-running story in real time, and deconstruction is rarely tidy. It's layered, emotional, uneven, but it's also revealing. And here's where the shift becomes undeniable. Acceptance has replaced persuasion. In the earlier chapters of this story, every disagreement carried an undertone of, how do we fix this? Even when emotions ran high, there was still a shared assumption that the family unit was non-negotiable. Now, that assumption is gone. No one is trying to convince anyone to stay. No one is crafting elaborate arguments about eternal commitment. Instead, we're seeing something much quieter: acknowledgement. That acknowledgement changes everything. Because once people stop trying to restore what was, they begin building what's next. Christine's segments feel like forward motion, not rebellion, not revenge, just movement. Her tone doesn't center around what she lost. It centers around what she's gaining: confidence, partnership, stability. There's an ease in her posture that didn't exist before. And ease is hard to fake over multiple episodes. Janelle's evolution feels grounded in practicality. She speaks about independence like someone who has already done the math, emotionally and financially. There's no dramatic soundtrack pushing her toward anger. It's just clarity, and clarity is powerful television because it feels earned. Meri's transformation might be the quietest but the most symbolic. For years, she remained connected to a structure that had emotionally moved on without her. Watching her finally detach doesn't feel explosive. It feels overdue. And when something overdue finally happens, the energy around it shifts from chaos to calm. Meanwhile, Kody's narrative feels like it's still orbiting the past. There's a repeated return to ideas of loyalty, respect, and betrayal, as though the ending is still being negotiated. But the others aren't negotiating anymore. They're narrating. That's the real shift. The power dynamic has changed from centralized authority to individual storytelling. And the show seems comfortable with that. Even the music choices, subtle as they are, feel less dramatic and more reflective. There's less emphasis on suspense and more on processing. Scenes linger after uncomfortable statements instead of cutting away. That editing choice suggests confidence. Confidence that the truth, however messy, is compelling enough on its own. There's also a growing sense that the audience is being treated less like spectators and more like witnesses. Witnesses to a slow unraveling. Witnesses to personal awakening. Witnesses to the consequences of imbalance. When reality television reaches that level of vulnerability, it stops being purely entertainment. It becomes documentation, and documentation feels intentional. Another layer to this shift is how forgiveness, or the lack of it, is handled. No grand reconciliations have been staged. No dramatic, tearful reunions designed to soften the narrative. Instead, forgiveness seems personal and private, not performative. That absence of spectacle reinforces the authenticity of what we're watching. If reconciliation were the goal, the structure of the episodes would look very different. But reconciliation doesn't appear to be the objective anymore. Resolution does. And resolution doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it means separation with clarity. The adult children's continued presence adds weight to that resolution. Their perspectives don't feel scripted to protect anyone. They feel lived in, honest. And when generational voices echo similar sentiments about distance and disappointment, it reinforces that the shift wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. Years of subtle imbalance, years of emotional triage, years of adapting, and now years of stepping away. Even Robyn's emotional responses feel shaped by this new reality. There's sadness there, yes, but there's also isolation. The dream of a unified plural family that she once described so passionately now exists mostly in flashbacks. And flashbacks, when used repeatedly, can feel like memorials. It's as if the show is quietly acknowledging, that chapter is over. The most telling part? There's no rush to define what comes next for the family as a whole. Because there is no whole in the way there once was. Instead, there are parallel journeys. Christine's joy, Janelle's autonomy, Meri's self-discovery, Kody and Robyn's recalibration, 4 separate arcs that once shared a center point. Now they orbit independently. That independence may be the clearest evidence that the shift wasn't accidental, it was inevitable. Plural marriage, as presented in the early seasons, relied heavily on balance. Emotional equity, shared sacrifice, coordinated effort. Once, that balance tilted, whether gradually or abruptly, the structure couldn't hold. And rather than hide that collapse, the show is letting us see it. That transparency might be the boldest choice of all. Because it risks dismantling the very premise that launched the series. It risks challenging viewers who once believed in the model being showcased. It risks rewriting its own legacy. But it also creates something rare in long-running reality television: evolution. Sister Wives is no longer about defending a lifestyle. It's about examining the cost of imbalance within it. And that examination feels deliberate. The tone is quieter, the pacing is slower, the conversations are sharper, the silences are louder. Something shifted. Not with fireworks, but with finality. And if you've been watching closely, you know exactly what that feels like. If you're ready to keep unpacking every subtle moment, every layered conversation, and every shift that doesn't feel accidental, make sure you're subscribed to The Truth in TLC, because we're breaking down what others won't say out loud.